Good afternoon, welcome. I'm Digby Ricci and I continue my series of lectures on Shakespeare's great tragedy, Hamlet. The first lecture laid out the central concerns of this multifaceted text. This lecture will deal with the character of Hamlet himself in more detail. As I've already pointed out, Hamlet's character has inspired volumes of commentary. They range from idealizing descriptions of him as the perfect, devout philosopher prince to Freudian denunciations of him as an Oedipal neurotic. It is important at least to attempt to see Hamlet as a complete character and not to overemphasize one aspect of an immensely complex figure, as Laurence Olivier did in his often powerful but excessively Freudian film. Hamlet is not a flawless deity, but a fallible human being. His considerable intellect and sensitivity do not prevent him from being guilty of misapprehensions and injustices. The most obvious is his bitter misogyny, loathing of women, prompted by his mother's actions. Nor does his genuinely disturbed, intensely melancholic condition render his views inaccurate or insane. He is a highly intelligent, even bookish hero, anguished by the corruption of his society, overawed by the moral complexity of the task imposed upon him, and isolated within the treacherous state that Claudius rules. Hamlet's gentleness and goodness, as displayed, to give only one obvious example, in his generous, trusting love for Horatio, alternate with outbursts of venomous misanthropy, which means detestation of humanity, aimed at both the guilty, Polonius, Gertrude, and Claudius, and the innocent, Ophelia. Such extreme fluctuations of mood are easily understandable when one examines Hamlet's position. Denmark's a prison, he bitterly declares to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He is popular with the ordinary people. Claudius even admits that he fears the love that the distracted multitude bears Hamlet, but he is confined to a fickle, sycophantic court. The courtiers are prepared to forget Hamlet's father and even pay 100 ducats apiece for a miniature of Claudius. He is intensely aware of the corruption and intrigue that are destroying a once noble state. Hamlet begins the garden imagery that runs throughout the play. He sees Denmark as an unweeded garden, a magnificent metaphor, dominated by self-destructive growth. Ophelia describes Hamlet as the rose of the state, and his nobility is as endangered in Claudius's court as is the growth of a flower in an unweeded garden. Hamlet's generalized disgust with the world has very valid causes, but this fact, of course, does not excuse all his excesses. From his very first appearance, Hamlet is presented as isolated, even as an outcast figure in the Danish court. His mourning clothes, his inky cloak, as he describes them, set him apart from the sycophantic, no doubt brightly clad courtiers, and his sharp response to his mother's implication that his intense grieving may be a display instead of a reality. "I know not seems," he snaps, indicates the intensity of his distress over his father's death. Satirical in his observations, "I am too much in the sun," he says with dark, bitter humour, loathing the corruption of the world, sickened by his mother's incestuous passion. He is certainly a victim of what the Elizabethans would have labelled acute melancholia, and that we would see as a form of depression. Immediately after Hamlet's savage outburst to Ophelia, concluding in "To a nunnery go," She expresses a sorrowfully loving view of him as the ideal, multifaceted Renaissance man, the glass of fashion and the mould of form. This is a reminder, and a very timely one to the audience, that Hamlet is not simply a bitter melancholic or a satirical mock lunatic. His verbal skill and his learning are demonstrated in every soliloquy. His scholarly attributes are proved by his committed friendship with the very scholarly Horatio. His courtly pastimes and active pursuits are demonstrated by his skillful fencing in the climactic duel scene with the supposedly invincible swordsman Laertes. These qualities do not vanish when Hamlet is plunged into profound melancholia. They remain part of his being. His flashes of tenderness for Ophelia, I did love you once. His passionate declaration of love for her over her grave. His intense and moving tribute to Horatio. Blessed are those whose blood and judgment are so well co-medalled. All demonstrate the virtues that never cease to be part of his nature. The misanthropic depressive and the performing wise fool are all part of the Renaissance man. The oppressive, vicious world that surrounds Hamlet has heightened his sorrowful and his bitter attributes, but his nobility is not obliterated, nor does melancholy blunt his insights. As modern psychologists will testify, depression can intensify rather than reduce one's perceptions. Hamlet's constant doubting of what seems to be the obvious solution to his dilemma may irritate those readers or spectators who are committed to Rambo-like action, but they are the stuff of moral heroism. What the great feminist critic Germaine Greer has called Hamlet's spiritual heroism is contrasted with the physical heroism of Fortinbras and the devious brutality of the corrupted Laertes. To quote Greer, Hamlet may torment himself with his inability to redeem his family honor by mass slaughter. Indeed, he must torment himself, but the way he has chosen, though painful and dangerous, is the right way. Unquote. Such doubting and probing of reality protect Hamlet from the poison in Denmark as a whole. Poison which is a lack of moral awareness, a refusal to question and analyze. For all his high-sounding pieties, this above all, to thine own self be true, Polonius pays a servant, spy, Rinaldo, to defame his own son so vilely that even the snooper protests. Polonius uses his daughter as a decoy, and he does not hesitate to spy upon a supposedly private encounter between mother and son. The Danish courtiers accept Claudius, go along with his speedy, dubious marriage, and forget the virtues of Hamlet's father, their noble previous king. Gertrude avoids confronting the black and bitter spots of her adultery and over-hasty marriage until Hamlet forces her to do so. Laertes, ostensibly a noble young man, blinds himself to the vileness of a carefully rigged duel. We do not doubt Hamlet's moral right to be scourge and minister in Denmark, because his doubts and questioning set him apart from a spiritually dead world. When Hamlet sets out with verbal savagery to wring his mother's heart, he wishes to awaken more than guilt. He wishes to awaken her moral awareness. Hamlet's real opponent as Germaine Greer brilliantly observes, is not Claudius's criminality, but the spiritual blindness in Denmark that allows Claudius to flourish. The changes and developments in Hamlet's nature during the course of the action are charted by the tragedy's celebrated soliloquies, which are more meditations than simply direct addresses to the audience. From suicidal despair and a generalized rejection of the corrupt, sensual world, oh, that this too sullied flesh would melt, Hamlet moves to a deeper grief, an awareness of more specific, more damnable evil, the actual murder of his father, and finally arrives at a dedication, if a self-doubting dedication, to revenge. The weeping of the player king in A Dream of Passion rouses Hamlet to condemn his own seeming inactivity as cowardice and to express murderous longings and angry curses. The "Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I" soliloquy, which you will find in Act 2, Scene 2, begins with an awed, even amazed consideration of the intensity of the player's acted emotions. This feeling is expressed in a sustained sentence and then two self-disgusted rhetorical questions. What's Hecuba to him that he should weep for her? What would he do had he the cue for passion that I have? These questions emphasize the contrast between the player's situation and Hamlet's own. With mounting anger and self-laceration, Hamlet proceeds to answer those questions. He would drown the stage with tears, and to condemn himself as a spiritless wretch and indecisive dreamer for failing to avenge such an atrocity as the damned defeat of his beloved father's life and kingship. Then Hamlet concludes that he must be a coward, pigeon-livered, not to act when such evil demands retribution. The passion inspired by his awareness of the enormity of Claudius's villainy drives him to outright invective, abuse, remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindless villain. The climax of this outburst, his cry of "Oh, vengeance!" restores him to rationality. And he indeed plans to take action, but reasoned action. The ghost's account must be authenticated. Claudius's villainy must be incontrovertibly proved. So this soliloquy highlights the conflict between passion and reason. Hamlet's passion breaks through the very rhythm of the verse with enraged shouts and curses. But interestingly, he returns to ordered verse to explain his plan, and even concludes the soliloquy with a rhyming couplet. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. In this soliloquy, Hamlet wrestles to reconcile reason and action. Action need not be unthinking. Rationality need not incapacitate one, make one powerless. Hamlet concludes that he will follow the course of revenge, but only after he has rationally demonstrated the necessity for revenge. In the most celebrated To Be or Not to Be soliloquy, Act 3, Scene 1, Hamlet ponders all the complexities of existence. He is not simply thinking of suicide, as some simplistic productions suggest, but rather of the best way in which he can fulfill his true being. He has just laid plans to prove Claudius's guilt, and he is confident that Claudius will reveal his evil. He has, therefore, no reason to dwell upon suicide. Rather, he is probing two contrasting, indeed two antithetical ways of living. the life of virtuous contemplation and the life of passion and action. The contemplative man will endure with pious acceptance all the miseries that the world heaps upon him. The man of action will challenge fate and combat the evils of the world. Death, as Hamlet defines it, is a release from the anguish of fleshly existence and also a transcendence of earthly pain. His use of the word consummation has religious connotations of a triumphant conclusion, a victory over the agonies of mortality. However, despite humanity's religious beliefs, the mystery of death continues to terrify human beings. The uncertainty of what will happen after death frightens humanity enough to ensure that people cling to life in spite of its manifold miseries. To accentuate just how fearful we are of the mystery of death, the undiscovered country, to quote one of my favorite metaphors in all literature, Hamlet details the earthly miseries that human beings are prepared to endure rather than to end their lives. He lists tyranny, unrequited love, delayed justice, the unjustified arrogance of those who hold high positions, and the rejection that true talent has to endure uncomplainingly. In his conclusion, Hamlet appears to be dismissing philosophical thinking as a form of weakness. He claims it strives to justify cowardice and it emasculates action. Thought is personified by Hamlet as pale and sickly. Determination and courage, resolution, have a vigorous natural colour or hue. However, Hamlet's lengthy exploration of the question of whether to live a thinking man's life or the simplistic existence of a man of action shows that the issue is more complex than a conflict between sickly thought and vigorous, healthy action. At the end of the soliloquy, Hamlet's insistence that intellect is anemic and prevents momentous tasks from being performed seems too glib for the profundity of his preceding points about death and the possibility of worse than earthly torments after death. Hamlet is striving to convince himself that the role of an avenger is the noblest role, but the complexities of the earlier section of the celebrated soliloquy indicate to us that the debate about which form of existence, contemplative or active, is the more virtuous, is not easily resolved. In the short soliloquy, uttered as he is about to go to confront his mother, Hamlet does display more definitely the feelings of the avenger. He will not kill Claudius while Claudius is praying, for Claudius killed Hamlet's father with all his crimes broad blown, and Hamlet has no wish to send Claudius to heaven. Many critics are appalled by the supposed cruelty of this short speech, and they point to the degradation of Hamlet by his dedication to vengeance. It is true that Hamlet has been hardened by the confirmation, through Claudius's response to the play, of the ghost's words, but he has not been entirely robbed of his humanity. One could in fact argue that Hamlet is rationalizing a lingering reluctance to taint himself with murder, no matter how just it may be. But whatever his motives, he remains aware of the spiritual implications of all human actions. As a sinful sensualist, Claudius should not be permitted to leave earth when he is at his best. His life has had no relish of salvation in it, nor should his death. Those who accuse Hamlet of usurping God's role in trying to dictate a soul's destination, forget that he is prompted by very natural feelings of filial pity and love. Hamlet's father was offered no chance to repent. Is not revenge rendered meaningless if it offers the original evildoer more mercy than was offered to his victim? Hamlet is more of the avenger here than he was in the to be or not to be soliloquy, but he is not in any way dehumanized. The "how all occasions do inform against me" soliloquy, which you'll find in Act 4, Scene 4, is another eloquent exercise in self-laceration. Hamlet disparages his own inactivity in contrast with the martial courage of the inexperienced but fiery Fortinbras. Yet, the speech contains ironies of which Shakespeare is certainly very aware. The emphasis on the smallness of the reward for such a vast military campaign does make one question the entire concept of honour in such a trivial quarrel. Is rightly to be great really to create an immense conflict over a trifling cause? The reader may be forgiven for thinking that here Hamlet himself protests too much and attempts to convince himself of the rightness of the oversimplified life of the bloody avenger. The soliloquies do not simply advance the plot of Hamlet by taking the central character from suicidal despair to commitment to action, no matter how dubious. They also allow Hamlet to explore all the contradictions of his own being. J.H. Walter, the scholar who edited the Heinemann edition of Hamlet in 1972, stresses in a very interesting introduction to that text that three strains may be observed in Hamlet: the gracious, multifaceted Renaissance prince, the grieving, melancholy man, at times intensely contemplative, at other times frenziedly passionate, the misanthropic jester figure using his antic disposition to satirize the corruption that encircles him. Obviously, these three elements that Walter defines so skillfully cannot be rigidly separated. Part of Hamlet's tragedy is that he is struggling to reconcile these elements of his being in a situation in which emotion is heightened and corruption is entrenched. The setting right of this terrifyingly out-of-joint time requires not merely the killing of Claudius, but also a commitment by Hamlet to a state of being. Hamlet wrestles with the complexities of his own nature, prince, avenger, satirical fool, because a choice of selfhood is involved in the successful enacting of his father's commands. Yet, simplifying his complex being is not easy or even desirable, for the very contradictions of Hamlet's nature make him the intellectual hero that he is. This would seem to be an appropriate time to conclude the second lecture. I have by no means finished my exploration of Hamlet's character. There is a great deal more to discuss, but that discussion shall take place in the third lecture, and I shall unite the rounding off of Hamlet's character with an examination of the image patterns and the language of the play as a whole. Thank you all very much.